Hi, this is Paul. I get recommendations from a lot of you for a lot of things. Videos I should watch, thinkers I should look into, books I should read, and I appreciate that. The question of what I actually wind up watching or reading is quite a bit more mysterious, even to me. I'll usually throw things on my blog or put things someplace, and often depending on the source of who it came from, the kind of thing that came to me, it will either get picked up or not picked up. And then if I pick it up and look at it, either I'll look at it all the way or just skim it or just dive into it. And maybe it won't make an impact, maybe it will. This all gets into the subtle art of colonizing another human being. A colleague of mine, so I have obviously people out there in my internet community and on Bridges of Meaning Discord and friends I've made since I've started my YouTube thing, yada, yada, yada. But this is a ministerial colleague of mine, sent me a recommendation on a podcast that kind of took me by surprise. A while ago, I think perhaps at the recommendation of a tweet from Eric Weinstein, I started following on Twitter Balaji Srinivasan, and I followed some of his tweets about COVID and some of these kinds of things. And then this colleague of mine sends me a Tim Ferris show podcast with Balaji, I hope I'm not saying his name wrong, Srinivasan. And it was sort of about Bitcoin, which really took me by surprise because there's Bitcoin in my life in certain places, but certainly not from this colleague. And he made a comment to the effect of, well, this is all the stuff you're talking about. And I thought, how am I talking about any of these things? And I've listened to most of the podcast. I've skimmed through the rest of it just because I wanted to get this out, because part of what makes it actually onto my channel usually has a great deal to do with what I'm thinking about at the moment and feeling like I want to talk about and want to process, so on and so forth. So, where to begin? Because some of this stuff is so weird and so strange, and I know some of my audience isn't anywhere near as nerdy as some other parts of my audience. And I'm not going to try to explain what Bitcoin and Ethereum and cryptocurrency are and why they might be important for the future and fiat currency. I mean, that's really not the focus of this channel, and I don't usually make videos about those kinds of things, mostly because I don't feel I know much of anything to contribute about some of these kinds of things. But here in this portion of the podcast I want to play, he starts talking about what is essentially a strategy for living. And just previous to the section I'm going to play, he talked about, now most of this advice seems to go towards young single people. Someone in my situation in life that has a family and people who depend on them and who is later in life. Some of this certainly might not apply, but basically the advice that this individual is giving is also sort of towards people who are very well educated, have a highly marketable skill that is in demand and can be worked at a distance. And so his advice is basically get a job that makes a lot of money that you can work over the internet and then go move to some low cost area that you want to live in and save all your money, and by that way it's sort of the poor man's FU money, where you can have a degree of financial independence, not because you've made a whole lot of money, which is sort of the way we often think about it, but because you spend very little money. Now, again, this is if your money spending is under your control, which usually means you're single. Once you're married, you at least have 50%, probably somebody else has a say over your lifestyle and where you live and how you spend your money. And once you have children, they pretty much take all your money, unless you have a whole lot of money, and on and on and on and on and on. But really, this section is about being cancel proof and being a square jawed Chad, which well, this will trigger some people in interesting ways. But then he goes into a whole bunch of other really interesting things that actually had a great deal to do with the last monologue video I did on platforms. And I do look at my analytics, and yes, videos that prominently involve Jordan Peterson always get way more views, and videos that have covers and titles that don't directly involve Jordan Peterson get far less views. And if I'm talking about something nerdy like the church and theories about the church and structure and culture, I love the comments on videos like that because, many of you leave excellent comments, but a vast majority of people, not the vast majority, but a lot of people who sort of keep a little eye on my channel don't come to the channel for that. This guy obviously is very, very smart. He's one of the creators of Coinbase. He's sort of he brings in thoughts about biology and society and technology and all kinds of things. And so he's one of those kind of guys that are out there. And he's fun to listen to, and I'm sure some of you know way more about this guy than I know about this guy, and some of you who have heard about this guy have opinions about this guy, whether he's all wet, or whether he's a guru, or whether he's half-baked, or who knows what. But I'm going to play a section here and do a little commentary on it that I thought was absolutely fascinating. It gets both into the history of the church, the Protestant Reformation, and a whole bunch of things that I'm interested in. And so, kudos to my colleague, I won't name you here, who pointed this out to me, but congratulations, you've successfully colonized me sufficiently, not only to listen to the podcast recommendation that you sent my way, but to actually have it show up on my channel. So I haven't yet checked the sound level, so I should probably do that in a minute.
Just as a thought experiment, let's say you're making, I don't know, 100,000 a year as an engineer, and before you were in San Francisco and you were burning like 90,000 of that a year or something. That's actually not insane. A lot of people do exactly that, right? Because the rent is so high and whatever. Right? Now you go to some rural.
So this is basically where he's talking about how to maximize your income.
Locale or even overseas, and now you're actually only burning, let's say, 50K a year, 40K in tax or what have you, and then like 10 or 20K, let's say it's 60K, okay? 20K in expenses because you just cut it all the way down. Well, now every year that you work, you have basically built up, because if your income goes away, your tax goes away as well. Every year that you work up, if you're spending 20K a year, you have 40K in savings. If you just do out the math, earn 100, spend 60, bank 40. If your spending is 20, then you have 2 years of runway, personal runway added for every year that you work there. And this.
Now, I should note that a lot of religious people have lived this way for a very long time, because at least a big part of, and especially religious people before the 20th century, people who lived through the Depression, enormous savers, people who lived through uncertain times, big savers, and because part of their religion was sort of keeping a close watch on their appetite desires, this is sort of how they lived. So it's so funny how this is all new and shiny, but I listen to it and I think it sounds like a lot of religious people.
In this simple toy example. And that means that you don't need to accept angel financing. You can self-finance. You can just, for every year you work, you can take 2 years off. It's basically a way of getting personal financial independence, like a deterministic path to doing it. Now,
so FU money, basically, but sort of in reverse.
Of course, you're no stranger to this. You've been talking about this stuff forever, with the 4-hour work week and whatever. This is not unusual for your audience. But I think that the perhaps somewhat novel is connecting this to ideological independence, because it means you can't be canceled. You can just ride it out like, the square-jawed Chad, yes. From, the memes I'm talking about. No?
No, I don't. What is a square-jawed Chad?
I even knew what that was. Me, and I'm by no means someone on the cutting edge of things.
Okay. This is very, very online. But if you Google the Chad, yes, it's like, someone being like, oh my God, I can't believe you believe this or whatever. And the guy's like, yes. And that he's just not backing down at all, just totally firm, square-jawed Chad. You never seen this?
No.
Okay,
no. That's all right. I didn't know who Taylor Swift was until like 4 years ago, so I'm a little sheltered. It would appear.
Yeah, it's like it comes from, yes, Chad, know your meme. Here, I'll send you the I'll send you the thing. Anyway,
I'll put this in show notes for people right next to drone warfare.
I bet 99% of your audience has. This
is also part of the reason I like the local meetup, which has been dormant for a while because of COVID, but it'll be fun to get going because it introduces me to all sorts of random things that I would never have bumped into if it weren't for all the crazy critters that go to the meetup and the Bridges of Meaning Discord server too.
Maybe it's obscure, maybe it's not. I don't know, but we'll have to see. Anyway, point is, how do you do the square jaw, Chad? Yes, it means you have to be able to, you're not backing down. You accept what consequences may come because you have planned for the future.
Now, what's also interesting about this is part of the meaning crisis is the fact that we sort of fear we are not our own. We begin to fear that we have been formed by propaganda. We have been duped by systems. This is what's so funny about postmodernity. Someone had just sent me I just threw it up on my blog. Someone had just sent me, it's kind of a ContraPoints. This is a trans woman who does philosophy talks on YouTube. And Jordan Peterson ideology. And, in terms of her philosophy, at least to the point of 23 minutes in, I thought, well, this is really quite solid. Just kind of walking through phenomenology, structuralism, post-structuralism, all of those kinds of ideas. Anyway, how did I get over to there? Part of the meaning crisis is the idea that we are not our own. And movies have been playing with this idea for a long time. That we wake up one day only to realize we are a robot or we are programmed. But in our case, we're programmed by the propaganda that permeates everything. And this actually is behind the idea of becoming awake or woke, becoming, suddenly now I see the truth. I've been living a lie. Now, again, this is an old religious theme. This is what happens when I make videos. I get random thoughts of other videos that I didn't make, and slides are still hanging out there. So maybe I'll bring it up. Hang on. One of the very interesting connections about current culture war and history is the relationship between woke and awakenings. Because awakenings this was the primary word used in the Puritan period about religious conversion. Timothy Edwards was the minister father in the colonial period, probably the most prominent American philosopher and theologian of the time, and some would argue of all of American history, Jonathan Edwards. And this is from George Marsden's biography of Jonathan Edwards. And Timothy Edwards, Jonathan's father, like many Puritan ministers, was an expert in awakening. So there's the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. This article that I've referenced to, I used in this video that I made. I didn't actually make the video, but some of you might be interested in it. This article that I use quite a bit, I really loved the thesis of this piece, how the civil rights movement converted liberal white Protestants to secularism. He argues that in many ways the civil rights movement was another great awakening in American culture, because these had been what were transforming American culture. Now, Timothy Edwards, following Puritan precedents, emphasized three principal steps towards true conversion. What does it mean to wake up? And, even someone like Sam Harris riffs on this. And the idea is that I'm a dormant robot, And, if we were to put these words in Brett Weinstein's transcending your assassin robot programming, it all sort of maps on together. And the Puritans were working on this quite consistently and programmatically for their lives. But only the first step is an awakening. And at least in puritanical terms, the awakening is to your bondage to the devil and the world. Your bondage to, well, it's actually all three traditional enemies of the Christian: your sinful nature, the devil, and the world. So the first step is awakening. So Timothy Edwards, following Puritan precedents, emphasized three principal steps towards true conversion. The first was conviction, or an awakening sense of a person's sad estate with reference to eternity. Now, obviously, in the Puritan frame, this has to do with one's vulnerability to the judgments of hell. But in the age of authenticity, it has everything to do with, what if I'm not an autonomous self? What if I am, in fact, just part of the gray people following along zombie fashion? And I could pull up, how many videos of people looking at phones. This actually, George Marsden pulls some of this stuff out from the 1950s because the idea was the company man. And so another awakening that happens in the 60s is the counterculture, where people wake up and release themselves from the shackles of working for IBM or something like this. Now, again, the meaning crisis is stalking all through this kind of thing, because the idea is that I've been hoodwinked. The Matrix riffs on this. You're a prisoner of your mind. What is the Matrix? You feel it when you go to church, when you pay your taxes, Morpheus says. So the Puritans were, working all of this stuff within their own frame. The term that Reverend Edwards used for this first but insufficient step was awakening. We must notice that usage because awakening is the most common term used for the periodic outbreaks of religious enthusiasm in New England congregations. And now this is interesting because people's idea of Puritans tends to be frozen chosen, stolid, emotionless people in pews going through standard liturgies. But if you look at the First Great Awakening, there's all these breakouts of religious enthusiasm, and people are crying and wailing and manifesting, and you can find this stuff in Pentecostal circles today. It's very interesting if you trace this stuff through American religious history. But a mere awakening was no guarantee of salvation. What do you mean by salvation? Well, it's regeneration. It's promise of deliverance. It's, I just talked about Calvinism in today's question and answer. It's recognition of your state as one of the elect, let's say. And young Jonathan had an awakening early on, but it didn't take. And the Puritans were well aware of this and understood that a lot of this is what happens. So an awakening was no guarantee of salvation. Jonathan described his ephemeral boyhood experience as one of the two most remarkable seasons of awakening. Timothy Edwards, Jonathan's father, like the vast majority of New England's preachers, was convinced that we must not flinch from warning sinners of the dangers of falling into unending hellish tortures. Timothy recorded how a parishioner named Abigail Rockwell had been first awakened from hearing such a question expressed in a sermon to unconverted sinners, namely, can you bear to live half an hour in fire? And if not, how do you bear to live in hell for all of eternity? Eternal conscious torment. Joshua Wallace Jr., a local farmer, reported how he was stirred to take more pains for an interest in Christ by fears of falling into the hands of an angry God. To benefit from the first awful warning, sinners had to reach a second step of true conversion, which was humiliation. And it's funny how you can sort of track this with a lot of the woke stuff. So first you wake up to the fact that you're a racist, or you're a bigot, or you're part of the problem, and now you need some, as John McWhorter says, some minister or priest to come and lecture you daily on the extent of your sin and to humiliate you into greater depths of righteousness. But of course, in contemporary woke religion, this is all this gets into this whole video I didn't make, and I didn't make this video because I don't really like talking about this stuff because it's just a pain. I talked about that on my question and answer this morning. This is Friday, so if you want to look at the Friday, April 9, especially towards the end of the Q&A, I pretty much told people exactly what I think of the whole woke, anti-woke wars and why the whole thing just sort of sickens me, because I really don't think it's going to produce much of anything good for the people it purports to help. But anyway, sometimes this stage was described as invoking a sense of terror. Puritan authors offered many complex lists of steps, and Timothy's standard was relatively flexible and simple in emphasizing 3 essential steps. But he does seem to have insisted on these, particularly this one. Potential converts not only had to recognize their guilt, deserving eternal flames, but be truly humbled by a total sense of unworthiness. And again, well, please tell me again how I'm an irredeemable bigot. And I mean, it's so amazing how this maps onto Puritanism. That's part of the reason when I saw this developing in the culture, it's like, I know what this is. I've seen this pattern before. Only then was one sufficiently prepared to reach the 3rd step, if God graciously granted it. Now again, notice that this is God's work, not the supplicant's work or even the minister's work, of receiving God's regenerating light, or a new spirit created in them, so that they truly repented and sin would no longer reign in them, but rather they would be guided by the Holy Spirit dwelling in them, and they would receive the gift of faith in Christ alone for their hope of salvation, and would gain and experience a glorious change to a life dedicated to serving God. And that experience was foundational and fundamental in this whole process. And I'm not reading this to disagree with it. I think that's a terrific mapping on the process of conversion. And in many ways, it's built into, if you follow any of my sermons, misery, deliverance, gratitude, where misery, we learn just how blinded and hoodwinked we are, just how much of a meaning crisis we're living in the midst of. Deliverance, that someone has intervened on my behalf, and that's huge humiliation. You know, it's sometimes not even the leap of faith, it's stumbling into it or being thrown into it by forces far beyond ourselves. And then the 3rd step of being graciously granted, and then how then can we respond to the grace given to us? So back to the podcast and my commentary on it. So who is the square-jawed Chad? Well, the square-jawed Chad is, in a sense, the authentic man or woman. A Chad woman, I don't know. But the authentic man or woman. Are my sound settings too low? Yes, they are. Now, some of you might have to adjust your volume, but they won't change again. So the square-jawed Chad, he's in a sense the one freed from the shackles of, but in our modern contemporary imaginary, it's propaganda or ideology, where you can be your authentic self. Well, I might even have to turn myself down a little bit. So that's the square-jawed Chad.
You know conflict may come, and you have essentially banked up. And so that's, let's call that one piece, right? Financial independence.
Right. And it requires, not to state the obvious, but it requires, or may not even require, courage the less fear you have, right? Yeah. If courage is acting in the face of fear, if you have minimized the risk or the damage of being canceled or any type of media retribution, you have less fear to overcome. It just makes it easier, like you said, to have that ideological freedom to hold a position.
That's right. The second thing is, if you read books like Beautiful Trouble, do you know what that is?
I do not.
Okay, so that's like
I feel like I'll be saying I don't and I do not a lot in this conversation. Please continue.
No. So Beautiful Trouble is an awesome window into another world, which is, it's sort of like, you know how it's a handbook for activists. And so you sort of learn, when you read it, you'll be like, whoa, I recognize that from this event and I recognize that from this event. And you start to realize actually how much stuff you read in the paper. Some part of it is sort of from corporate PR, but another big chunk of it is from activist PR.
Now notice what we're doing here. So you want to be the square-jawed Chad. You want to be, past generations would say, the self-made man. You want to be this one who is a rock, an island, owned by no one, the authentic self. Well, that's not quite so easy because everything around you is constantly colonizing you. And especially in a democratic moment, I mean, the path to power is gaining the consciousness of the mob and riding the mob into the White House or into wealth, or to become, language just reveals itself, to become an influencer. That's the goal. But you don't want to be the influencee. You want to be, well, the Mooks and Knights dynamic, of course, always goes both ways. But you want to be the square-jawed Chad. You want to be the independent thinker. You want to be the one person who rises above the rest and knows all the answers. And, of course, Balaji Srinivasan is in some ways the square-jawed Chad, because I'm sure he's fabulously wealthy and he's brilliant and he's on this podcast and he's founding corporations and he doesn't need angel investors. He may be the angel investor. And so now here the one who has arrived quite early in life is going to tell us how we can arrive and give us the secrets of his success. But, well, so here we go.
For example, taking a laser pointer-ish thing and shining a logo onto the side of a building. There's various kinds of stunts like this. But the one that's relevant here is there's this concept called spectrum of allies, where you've got people who are at, let's say there's 5 categories: strongly supportive, weakly supportive, neutral, mildly opposed, and strongly opposed.
Now when you start talking about this, it's like, wow, yeah, I have been. So now suddenly I'm having a little mini meaning crisis in me. I have been duped. Spectrum of allies. And, then he goes through these, boy, this sounds like how many surveys I've taken. And, and this is actually quite interesting.
And your goal as an activist is to recognize you can't just move people from +2 to -2 right away. What you do is you try to find some incident or thing that is bad, and then you go and you put a microphone to everybody and you force them to comment on this person or this incident. Be like, can you excuse this horrible thing? And you try to force them from a +1 to a 0 or what have you, right?
And again, once he says it, you see this all the time. And this is sort of the fuel of the outrage culture. And of course, one thing that I've commented on quite a bit, behind it is this consensus about morality, which, again, Dominion is the product of, generations of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation. I mean, so this outrage, can you believe this is wrong? And again, and this is so smart. You're moving people just a little hair. You're not going to have them, listen to you and, now I'm whatever flag you have around your tribe. You just want to sort of move it along. It's, a friend of mine, in talking about how he led his church, it was always sort of the rocking chair leading. What do I mean by that? Have you ever sat in a rocking chair and you start rocking someplace, and when you look at the rocking chair, you think, rocking chair doesn't go anywhere. It just goes back and forth. But when you actually watch the rocking chair, you notice, no, you're actually kind of rocking across the room, because there's just these tiny little incremental movements with every back and forth on the rocking chair, and then there you go.
Now, that is actually a very premeditated thing. One way of visualizing it is it's an attack on your social network. Okay, this is a premeditated thing. It's
an attack on your social network. Okay. Why would my social network be attacked? Well, because, hate to say it, you're a product of your social network. What? I'm not an autonomous, free-thinking individual who just is spewing my authentic selfness to a monochrome world? No, you're formed, you're made, you're a product of your social network. Yeah, sure, you have some influence in it, but they have a lot of influence over you too, because, again, back to Petersonian ideas, you're always sort of readjusting your internal equilibrium in terms of whether you're gaining status or losing status. And generally speaking, within a social network, you're going to be, if you're telling the people in your social network what they want to hear, you're gaining in status. And so this is this process that in some ways it's quite likely that social media has reinforced and influenced, and that's part of the reason we're getting this polarization.
It's not like a organic thing, and it's a spectrum of allies. And one way of thinking about this is you have a social network supply chain. Okay, so visualize yourself. You're a node at the center, and you
have a social network supply chain. Now, he talks really fast, and these ideas are fairly new. So it's like, whoa, slow down, slow down. I have a social network supply chain. Okay, you're being formed by them. You're being shaped by them. And so if your meaning self, your meaning crisis self is constructed by the formation around you, just like there's a supply chain to build smartphones or computers or all of this stuff. Of course, Apple is great at supply chain. If there's the supply chain to do this, back during the beginnings of COVID, we had questions about the supply chain for PPE. Where does our ibuprofen come from? Where do our respirators come from? Where do our masks come from? Oh my goodness, they're all coming from China. Oh my goodness, now there's a chip shortage. Everybody's making Bitcoin, and so nobody can buy a decent graphics card because they want to play computer games on a self-built computer. And of all this complies, but you have a supply chain into your social network. And all of those nodes are also semi-self-conscious and also have their own supply chains. And a lot of those supply chains run together, but a lot of them are distinct. So, well, there's the idea.
You have your employer, let's say your CEO, you have your investors, you have your employees, you have your customers, right? There's all these nodes around you. I'm talking about from like a tech startup context, but you can, of course, generalize this to something else. And those nodes can be colored. Let's say they're gray or blue or red. They can be colored according to their ideology. And the most important thing about your social network supply chain, and this is not obvious, it is what periodicals they read and respect.
And not just periodicals, but whatever their sources of information are. Okay, well, now we're getting into the whole rebel wisdom sense-making conversation, because what is constructing their world around them? Because the information that they are getting is what's constructing their world. And, my goodness, in the United States over the last number of years, we've had a huge lesson in this. Okay, do you watch Fox News or do you watch MSNBC? Well, there's one. What TV stations do you watch? What podcasts do you listen to? Do you listen to Do you listen to Jordan Peterson? Do you listen to Ta-Nehisi Coates? On and on and on and on and on. Your world is constructed by the information that you're getting, and you're trying to do sense making by virtue of that information. And so, well, this is your supply chain. These are the elements that are forming your world.
Because those periodicals have root access to their brains. If a periodical...
Now, root access, of course, he's talking in computer terminology. Well, what's root access? Well, way back in the day when Android phones were new and iPhones were new, people wanted to run certain apps that would get around the limitations of the operating systems that were trying to protect you from yourself. And so what you would do was you would jailbreak, that's one of the things, or you would root your phone and gain root access. You have this in PCs too. Basically, root access is the most basic level of access to the hardware. You're very, very low in the stack. And so what he's saying is that the periodicals that people read, the information, the news sources that people gather from, they themselves are going to be a function of the information that they are gathering. And so therefore, the influencers in their life is this whole social supply chain that is forming them. In other words, the non-player character is a function of the programming being done by all of their sources of information. And again, we certainly see this of others. Well, you just believe this because you go to church, or because you watch Fox News, or because you listen to Jordan Peterson, or because you listen to Paul Vanderklay, or because of this, you believe all those things. You're really a non-player character, and I can see you. And then the meaning crisis happens when we look in the mirror and we say, oh my goodness, I'm a non-player character who's just a product of all of my social media choices too. And so in some ways he's asking you, well, take a look at what you're feeding from.
Suddenly says, let's say the Wall Street Journal, and you've got a bunch of Republicans surrounding you, for example, right? The Wall Street Journal suddenly says you are bad. All of those people who read and respect the Wall Street Journal will suddenly, like zombie-like, turn their eyes glowing red and start excommunicating you. Or they'll move in the spectrum of allies. So the guy who is on the fence may quit. The person who's really strong and strong supporter might move to what the minimum contractual obligation is.
So all I have to do is say something bad about Trump, and a bunch of people are like, unsubscribe. They don't really unsubscribe. It's like, I'm not going to listen to Vanderklay anymore. I'm going to listen to Mr. Reagan, or I'm going to listen to Tim Pool, or I'm going to listen to someone else. And so we're always sort of going back and forth in this way. And again, he's right that it's not just, oh, Vanderklay said something unsolicited about Donald Trump, unsubscribe. Every now and then you get that in the comment section, which is kind of funny. You said such and such, I'm unsubscribing. Okay. It's just, it is kind of fun to have a YouTube channel. And really your fans are far more powerful than your critics, because criticize me, it doesn't feel good, but it's the positive feels. The old psychological experiment where the class decides they want to put the teacher in the corner, so every time the teacher makes a step towards a corner, they all smile. The teacher doesn't know what's going on, but they're programming the teacher. And so before you know it, the teacher's in the corner, because every time the teacher took a step towards the corner, they smiled. And something inside the teacher's brain was like, ooh, positive, dopamine. So then pretty soon he or she winds up in the corner. That's the difficulty of this whole, if you want to have influence over someone, praise them. And if you learn that about human beings and you decide you're going to learn that about yourself, oh, be careful with the people who praise you. Be careful with the people who do good things for you, because you're losing your sacred autonomy.
And so the attack, it's like a mortar that lands in somebody's social network neighborhood. That's what negative press is. Negative press is an attack on your social network. Now, how do you mitigate this? Well, first, as I mentioned, you're like a quote sovereign individual. You're financially independent. So
okay, so what's our telos here? What are we looking for? We want to be a sovereign individual.
People pull away, it doesn't matter. But second, and more important, you need to actually identify where likely attacks are going to come from, and make sure you actually choose your friends, your employees, everything, such that that's actually robust to foreseeable kinds of attacks.
And I think people do this implicitly. They do it in their language. You sort of get used to doing this kind of thing if you're used to speaking in public.
Right? You robustify your social network supply chain in the same way that a judicious person who runs a manufacturing plant is thinking, okay, China has some supply chain risk. You are thinking, okay, that person has social network supply chain risk. I think they would go south in this event. And then you might want to get them off the board, or you might want to not hire them as an employee or have them a contractor. And that's actually better for them as well, because they may or may not know it, but they're basically like the Manchurian Candidate. They've got like a remote chip in their brain, and they're just like this when you're denounced. Okay. And now we have it actually relatively good in, the West. In, the term canceled, by the way, it's actually very juvenile. It kind of comes from like TV shows being canceled, like cancel cultures, like teenagers complaining about it. And this sort of elliptical way of complaining about it has made its way up to 30 and 40 and 50 somethings discussing this topic. But the original term for being canceled was being purged. That's what they called it in the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China and so on, right? And it could well be said that in the Soviet Union or the PRC, an editorial was a prelude to an extrajudicial execution. You wouldn't just, quote, get canceled and lose your friends. You'd lose life, liberty, and or property. You'd be shot or jailed or certainly expropriated or all of the above.
Sent to a labor camp in the Cultural Revolution.
Correct. And the other nodes in your social network might be as well. Like if you were, a member of a family that had a known capitalist rotor in China, not really very good. It was possible, just like people come back from being canceled. Deng Xiaoping was actually purged 3 times. His son was thrown through a window and, like during the Cultural Revolution and was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. So, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that happened in other countries. It got even more violent than it has so far in the US, but we'll see what happens, with that. Anyway, point is that, so that's a second mode of defense. First is personal financial independence, and second is collective independence. You want to really think through who the nodes are that are associating with you.
And again, when I listen to this description, I see, because religious communities have been doing this all along, because in many ways, religious communities have worked these matrices for very long times. And that's part of the reason propositional truths and confessions and all of this stuff sort of work the way it does. And a little bit later, he's going to get into the Peace of Westphalia, where a lot of this comes through, because this is really true. And what happens at a certain point, especially if you've been working in religious environments, like someone like myself, like a pastor does, you begin to recognize, oh, I do this stuff all the time. You're always sort of figuring out how to talk by virtue of this entire system out there, because, the one thing, especially if you work for a religious institution, canceling, you see all this cancel stuff going out in culture, and people are like horrified that you can lose your job over an opinion. It's like, I could lose my job over all sorts of opinions. You figure that filter out. But part of the separation of church and state is that, well, at least you don't go to jail or you don't get burned at the stake. I mentioned to, I forget who I mentioned to, it might have been Rafe Kelly, where I said, the Catholic Church didn't really kill anyone. The Catholic Church had the king or the emperor or the local magistrate kill people. That's the way it worked. And in some places when, for example, Martin Luther didn't get got because his magistrate's like, nah, you're not killing my monk. You can go jump in a lake if you want to. I don't care. I'm not killing him. And then Catholic Church just has to, how can we get the government to do what we want it to? Well, this is a very old game.
By the way, one interesting consequence of this, if you flip it around, is if you have a monochromatic supply chain, there's basically nobody, for example, at the New York Times Company who reads and respects Breitbart. So Breitbart has zero effect on the New York Times Company. No node there can be Manchurian candidate by them. But the New York Times Company, absolutely, if you go to Breitbart's like extended social network supply chain, there's absolutely folks, whether it's ads or other kinds of things that read and respect NYT. So A can publish an article that has no effect on B, but B can publish it and it has an effect on A. Another example is
and that's asymmetry, which is a very potent thing if you're in ideological warfare against someone else. Xinhua
Daily. And by the way, I'm not saying anything pro or con about Breitbart or NYT. I'm just making an observation of fact there. Another example is Xinhua Net, in China, the Chinese, People's Daily. If you're Chinese and they denounce you, your whole social network supply chain is like, whoa, the government just denounced this guy. You're in trouble. If you're in the US, nobody even reads Chinese or even cares. Hey, these guys are totalitarians. Who cares? Or at least that's what folks, you'd be able to brush it off. And so it's more than just quote red or blue or whatever. There's other colors to it, right? Whatever you assign the color to the CCP or what have you. And so, another one might be if Al Jazeera denounces you or Russian state media denounces you. You've got vulnerabilities to different kinds of things. If you were a Russian expatriate, you might be much more concerned if, RT suddenly started going after you than if you were just some random, American or even a Chinese person. Go ahead. Let me pause there.
Well, I was thinking I'd be curious to hear what else you have thought about for yourself in terms of self-defense. If there are any tactical recommendations, and just also to come back to one of the examples you gave with reducing your expenses by 5x. Would you not, so it's a combination of questions, you can take them in either order, but if you were employed by a tech company, whether that's a Google, a Facebook, or otherwise, is that not a significant vulnerability in the system? While financially, if you maintain your job, you can withstand, say, public denouncement or media denouncement, but the company may not have the same willingness.
Absolutely. So let me get to point number 3. So point number 3 is I gave a whole series of talks on this, and I've been thinking about the technology for it as well, something I call the pseudonymous economy. So the thing is that real names weren't built for the internet. Real names are actually a technology. In fact, real names are a stolen base in many ways. Even the term real name is a stolen base. It's better called a state name or a social security name.
And this is just fascinating. And what's fascinating about this is my experience both in living in a place like, get ready to check it off on bingo, the Dominican Republic, where people had multiple names. We have the multiple name that's on your government ID card. You have the name that people in the village call you. And often part of the reason it's different on the government ID card and the people in the village is because the government ID card might have got that from a friend through a friend. And some Dominican might have said, oh, yeah, I gave birth to him 25 years ago, so he's my son, so he's really Dominican. And a lot of stuff going on. But it's also very interesting in the book of Revelation, for example, people have this name that is given to them by God. And it's not the name that they have running around in the world. And it's very interesting because these names are, in fact, you're sort of named by your patron. Or that doesn't translate for a lot of you. You're named by the arena that you're in. It's the whole agent-arena relationship here. Your identity is a function of the arena that you're in. If the arena is family, my identity is father. If the arena is state, my identity is citizen. If the arena is church, my identity in the Christian Reformed Church is minister of the word. Your identity, your name, is a function of the arena that is manifest at the moment.
Because it's a global identifier. It's an identifier that anybody can type into a database and pull up all kinds of information on you. And this is something where historically past cultures understood that giving out someone's real name was actually very bad, or knowing it, you had power over that person. The reason is that if you read this book,
because the real name exposes and illuminates the base reality or the governing reality or the governing arena that is holding sway on the relational dynamics of the moment. I know that sounds terribly esoteric, but hopefully the illustration works for you.
Like a state.
Seeing like a state.
Yeah, Seeing Like a State. So this is a great book by Yale University Press that essentially talks about how names were developed to, among other things, simplify the process of conscription. So rather than, that guy over there with brown hair, which is an analog identifier that could refer to a bunch of folks and that was imprecise, instead you'd say John Davison. And that first name, last name it's not perfect. It's not quite as good as
And of course, in a dreaded patriarchal society, David's son is David's son. And if I look back in my genealogy into my Jewish ancestry, I noticed when I looked back into that, it's like, oh my goodness, they just keep flopping these names. And when they came to America and the courthouse burned down in the town that they were living in, they got rid of the Jewish, patronymic system and sort of yankified, sort of anglicized a couple of the names, and that became the name of my grandfather and his brother.
Number, but it's a reasonably good digital identifier where you could go down a list and cross it off. And the thing is that would not just be conscription. You couldn't have even executed like Leninist redistribution of property very easily without those lists. It was all about the lists. Literacy is what actually enabled a big chunk of that. You had lists of names. That guy's rich. That guy's not rich. Take his property, etc. So the point being that the alternative to real names, or like a single global identifier and everything, is pseudonyms, search-resistant identities, which people are already using at large scale. There's 400 million pseudonyms, or pseudonymous users on Reddit. And by the way, there's a distinction between anonymous, pseudonymous, and real name. Anonymous is totally disposable identifier. That's like the culture of 4chan. That actually is kind of a pit. Pseudonymous, like Reddit, is a persistent pseudonym that accumulates reputation, but that is at a distance from your global identifier. In general, what I think is the peace of Westphalia at the end of our 30 years internet war is going to be...
Hold on, pause for definition. If I could click on
Know your history.
You say Westphalia?
Yeah. So from 1618 to 1648, Protestants and Catholics slugged it out over religion, but also over power. Who's going to rule the Catholic Church, or Martin Luther's guys, disciples.
Not a great rendition of the Peace of Westphalia, because one of the things that you notice is that when people look at the Protestant Reformation, that was a religious struggle. Not merely religious, it was deeply political. And the solution eventually was a political solution. And when we talk about the relationship between nationalism and imperialism and religion, again, another question I got in the question and answer today, things start to make sense about the way the modern world is constructed.
Of Protestants, very bloody war, lots of killing. And it was basically centralization versus decentralization, among other things. And eventually the truce that came about was the so-called Peace of Westphalia, which established the modern nation state.
I was just thinking how happy it makes me that you thought I might even know that. I'm so honored. So thank you. But no, please continue. I don't want to take us off track. But it made my day. That just made my day. Thank you.
I don't mean to drop an obscure reference, and there's lots of areas of history that I don't know about, but this is one that I think about a lot because it's highly relevant, I think, to the present day in many, many different ways. Arguably, the 30 Years' War arose out of the introduction of the printing press, because you could go and mimeograph.
Trigger that white cat meme. There you go, meme boys. You're all over it.
All of Martin Luther's stuff and spread to people. And that's how, you did the software install, boom, into people's brains. And that's Protestant Reformation. Distribution, took off.
Platforms. What was happening? It's the decoupling of, state has to rearrange itself. Church has to rearrange itself. Now suddenly with a printing press, you're the social media formation of the people are coming through printed words. Well, who's printing things? Well, people who own printing presses. And what the people who have printing presses aren't necessarily producing content now, of course. Now in the internet age, guess what? Vanderklay, who's producing content, has a printing press, an amazing printing press in terms of a YouTube channel. That's what I'm doing.
So this technology gave rise to this huge fight that essentially redrew the map. And the concept of the nation state was born out of that, which is, okay, you don't have these transnational entities that
the Roman Catholic Church
just can have influence everywhere. Instead, we're going to have these sort of geographic.
And now he's greatly simplifying the relationship between church and state in the late medieval period, or really any period since Constantine.
Defined areas that have a sovereign government with a monopoly of violence, and a religion can't just walk in there and just start bossing people around. There's like a lawful government. That was the truth.
And so what's going to happen is you're going to decouple religion from state, because, now, states have a stake in the religious game, which they do. But it very quickly, not very quickly, but it inevitably becomes evident that there needs to be a decoupling. And of course, one of the first great experiments of that is the United States. But we're now continuing to process, can you actually have a nation state if there's not a degree of commonality among certain basic presuppositions and assumptions about historical narratives? That's the question that we're sort of in the middle of right now.
Groups of people came to. You stay in your lane, I stay in mine, just out of all the bloodshed and to stop the bloodshed. So I think we've just began. Hopefully, there's not bloodshed or not much of it. I think we've just begun. People think we're ending it, but I think we've just begun the global internet like Cold War, where all of these social networks, currency networks compete for ideological and economic dominance around the world because they can just spread virally back and forth like this. And everyone will be trying to cancel each other and whatnot. It's going to be this crazy, crazy thing. For example, one thing I anticipate will happen sometime in the 2020s is, I think in some country, probably the US, for lots of reasons, I think the cloud will burst. And what I mean by that is like Treasury was just recently hacked with the SolarWinds thing. People don't know what they got. They could have gotten every tax return. They could have gotten all kinds of very sensitive stuff. And
it was hacked with what? I'm sorry.
Oh, SolarWinds is sort of the name of the hack. And,
I see. Got it.
And the scope of it is not fully understood. It's like this total ownage of all kinds of government systems. And this is not the first time this has happened. It's also happened at the government of Texas and so on and so forth. I'm not pointing at any particular entity. The main thing is when there was a recent hack of Ledger, the crypto company, their database was just blasted on the internet. And you could actually, I wasn't a customer, but people could see their name and their home address on the internet. And they're like a crypto fanatic who has a hardware wallet on there.
What a nightmare. What a nightmare. Oh my God.
And so it is like this.
And I know those of you who don't know anything about crypto are like, huh? What? So what if they have their home address?
Thing where, you don't, you can't easily change your home. I mean, some people can.
Yeah, suddenly you have guys in tracksuits showing up at your house.
Potentially. Exactly. It's like a rank ordered list of who holds crypto. Really, really, really sucks. May lead to home invasions, other kinds of things. Very bad piece of information to have out there. It's an enriched list. So it's hard for.
Now, the focus here is on, currency. Well, okay, currency is a big deal. And politics, politics is a big deal. But in terms of the stack, notice how the entire cancel culture works on the assumption of the moral layer. Of narratives of moral agreement. That's where it is on the stack. And so, religion is dead. No. Religion is the most basic level. And, it begins in the Protestant Reformation, and nation states sort of step in. Because, before there was always this uneasy relationship between the magisterium, the magistrate and the religious organization. So when I say magisterium, right there you begin to see some of the blend between the religious organization and the government. And, Nate Heil on the Question and Answer Day talked about his Christian anarchism, which I think he rightly connected it with a lot of Anabaptist theory, because Anabaptist theory tends to, and the Anabaptist part of the Protestant Reformation was the Radical Reformation. And I made the comment in the Question and Answer today that actually, in a lot of ways, a lot of Anabaptist ideas won, even though Anabaptist organizations didn't really win. And I think part of that has to do with sort of the nature of Anabaptist theory applied to organizations. It's a difficult thing to work. So maybe maybe some of you Anabaptists will have problems with that, but that's okay. You know where to find me. So there was more on this I wanted to get to. Hang on. Okay, I'm jumping ahead, and he's talking about the 2008 housing meltdown and the banks. And again, some of you are going to have a lot of opinions about this. I don't. But where he goes with this is really quite interesting.
Technology came in through the windows in the chimney or what have you, and is actually sort of reforming the system against their will. Like Dodd-Frank did not reform the banks; it just sort of enshrined them. It was a coronation in the name of a regulation, right? Yeah, it did reduce some of their profit levels in some ways, but it made them like more invulnerable. Go ahead, you're gonna say.
No, I'm smiling. I'm enjoying. So,
Yeah.
And for those who can't see us, because we're probably not going to be publishing video, we are currently on video, so we can watch each other's facial expressions. Please continue.
Sure. Yeah.
I like the coronation disguised as regulation.
Right. Exactly. Right. So it is literally picking winners because you're writing the regulation that assumes a certain structure and capital requirements. I mean, like the concept of a smart contract was not contemplated in Dodd-Frank, like a contract that could be executed independently of a judge or a person. Okay, what's my point? Point is, as faith in I don't think many institutions that predated the internet will survive the internet.
That's a big statement. But I think about that with respect to the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church survived the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation hit in certain places in Europe very unevenly. It hit the Holy Roman Empire, it hit the Netherlands, it hit Switzerland, it hit England, it hit Hungary. It hit some of these places, and from those places, it spread out throughout the rest of the world. Obviously, in North America, in the United States, became a deeply Protestant nation. Roman Catholicism really started to impact at the middle of the 19th century. But what the Protestant Reformation did was force the Roman Catholic Church to basically address it in a number of ways. And there's a lot of elements to the Counter-Reformation. It's interesting how, robust religious traditions are. And it's, his comment there, I think, is profound. Yet at the same time, one of the comments I made with respect to platforms, the kind of disruption that the internet does and technology in general doesn't seem to always displace older things, but rather relocates them. For example, horses are still around. Horses are a fine hobby. Like I said, I have a cousin whose wife is now a farrier. She does horseshoes that's her job. She was working in an office. She likes this a lot better. It's a physically demanding job, but she enjoys it. And this is part of the reason why I made the quip on Twitter about Beth Moore. Beth Moore inspiring women to keep horses. Beth Moore, imagine her sort of the founder of Uber, inspires women to keep horses. In other words, women to lead churches. And in some ways, are churches like horse stables as compared to Beth Moore, who, first via Bible studies, colonizes and infiltrates churches, infiltrates and penetrates social networks. Before there were social networks, churches, in many ways, one of the ways, if you want to influence churches, is through, this is basically how John Calvin did it. Calvin's Institutes became enormously popular, an enormously popular book, and via the printing press and John Calvin's Institutes, he influenced generations of Protestants in Europe, and of course he had Geneva, and some of his ideas take root through John Knox in Scotland and through the Puritans over to America. And, those are powerful things as opposed to what was, happening officially in places. And it's in that way that the leadership of institutions lose control because these ideas just go out through these other platforms and take over.
It is this universal asset. And the reason is because it connects people peer to peer. And so what that does is one of my laws of internet physics is the internet increases variance. Okay. Why?
Think about that. Laws of internet physics. Because a lot of times, this guy talks so fast and he's throwing so many ideas out there. And these ideas he's been living with and they're familiar to him. But you have to kind of slow him down and say, the internet increases variance. Okay, what do you mean by variance? Diversity. So part of what happens in confessional churches is that, and again, this is a product of the Protestant Reformation. Confessionalism was a way to manage diversity, and nation states were going to have a unified confession that was going to define them as nation states. that continued to break down, and another step in the breaking down of that was religious toleration, where now the federal government of the United States, well, early on, different states had their own state churches, but states gave them up. There would be religious toleration. But then you begin to ask, well, you have these religious confessions. What are the commonalities between them that are actually, in some ways, being the non-confessional implicit religions that are affording the cooperation of the state to function? And so actually a lot of what I do on my YouTube channel is I'm always trying to discern, and we've been talking about this for a generation in church planting land, trying to exegete the culture. Because there are religious confessions beneath the surface, and Jamie Smith has written about this in a lot of his work with his cultural liturgies, that there are cultural liturgies, there are religious liturgies beneath the surface that are propagating themselves. And now what the internet does is increase variance. And this is why, so on, let's say, a place like an estuary, like the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, there's enormous variance in the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. How can we have productive conversations despite the enormous confessional variance? In some ways, that's been a part of my life's work. It's been a part of what's at the heart of this channel. I mentioned in the question and answer today, I recently did an interview with a young man who's in an evangelical seminary, and someone made the comment, we need more evangelicals. You should talk to more evangelicals. And part of me thought, I kind of talk to who comes forward. I'm not really picking. But another part of me thought, I like talking to a lot of different people, because I think one of the key skills we're going to need to develop is this capacity to talk across confessional lines, not only confessional lines within Christendom, but religious confessionality beneath the surface. And this, I think, is part and parcel about what Balaji Srinivasan is talking about in the internet age, because variance has now increased enormously. And so actually what we're doing, as we're, again, back to Jordan Peterson's first lecture in the biblical series, what we're doing is watching each other to develop, the IDW protocol to figure out how can we do these conversations well. And I do think that David Fuller is very right, that in some ways a lot of the particular members of the IDW failed in the IDW protocol because sort of the inevitable happened, especially if your goal is to be an influencer, you want to pump up those numbers. And one of the ways that you pump up your numbers in terms of your influencer followership is some of this mooks and knights dynamics, where don't cross your audience. But in some ways, some of this IDW protocol is going to be dependent upon a capacity to figure out how to get at deeper and deeper levels of productive agreement as we work on this stuff.
So first, let me give the observation, right? The observation is you go from 30-minute sitcoms to 30-episode Netflix binges or 30-second YouTube clips. You go from, a stable 9-to-5 job to a 20-something billionaire or a 40-year-old failed son who's made nothing of themselves. You go from a taxi ride, standard taxi ride, to Uber, which actually has very long trips and also very short ones. Like, the whole thing is spread out relative to the ride time of a normal taxi. And the reason for this, this is a very common thing in every area. I've seen hundreds, probably thousands of companies at this point. I've seen all these graphs, right? So you'll have to believe me that this is a synthesis of a lot of different graphs that I've seen. When the internet disruptor comes in, variance increases. There's more downside and more upside, more amazing outcomes and more really bad outcomes in all kinds of ways.
And I think this is exactly what we're seeing in terms of religious confessionalities. It's, if the Protestant Reformation sort of became this massive fracturing of the church. Well, in some ways, it looks like the internet is a massive crushing of confessionality as a means of having church. That's a terrifying thing, because that's a massive dislocation. And it's, it's something this is a big deal.
Is that happen? Because it connects people peer-to-peer, entities peer-to-peer, it removes the middleman. It removes the mediator.
And in many cases, the middleman in religious organizations in the United States is the pastor. It's the middleman this is profound stuff.
It removes the moderator. It removes the mediocrity. Now, each of those words has a different connotation. Getting rid of the middleman, everyone cheers, yay. Getting rid of the moderator, people are like, oh, I'm not so sure. Getting rid of the mediocrity, again, everybody cheers. So those are all kind of similar words, but they mean somewhat different implications. But they're all true at the same time. So what happens is you have these communities that then arise where nodes that can never connect to each other, boom, they form some bizarre subreddit or some amazing thing like ETH research, which is or Y Combinator. So it's like I don't know if you've ever centrifuged anything. Have you ever centrifuged anything?
I can finally.
And so then when I listen to this and I think about the application of this in my sphere, I think, well, what I sort of see happening around me, especially trying not to make this space make this a reactive space, make this a parasitic space. Again, I think Jonathan Peugeot's Parasitic Storytelling is foundational, because if I allow my channel to be parasitic in the sense that I am relying on, well, pick your culture war nemesis. I'm relying on my nemesis and on hatred against my nemesis in order to propel me up the hierarchy. And we see this in politics all the time. I'm going to vote for Biden to get Trump out of office. I'm going to vote for Trump because he's going to really, the libs hate him. All this parasitic group formation is really poison. Because you can't build anything. And so then in the age of the internet, you have to figure out, how can we build when what the internet and the internet disruptions bring is variance. Here's another interesting section.
Quote, QAnon or something, but contrarian and correct. You know what I mean? And that's actually like the whole teal thing. You're actually making something that is in that quadrant. And so those folks are not folks who are likely to just go down without a fight. The whole thing. These are activists, and
also highly anti-authoritarian, generally speaking.
Yes, but capable of organizing. So not
yep.
So it's an important combination, right? The way I describe the community, actually, this is the best parts of the community. There's all kinds of crazy actors in crypto who I wouldn't endorse, but maybe this is an idealization. Maybe this is the community I want to build. But I think it is fair to say that the best tech folks and the best crypto folks are win and help win, which is actually neither.
I agree with that.
Yeah. So here's the thing about that, right?
See, and win and help win, and that's very different from parasitic.
That win and help win is neither progressive nor conservative nor libertarian. And let me explain why. Okay. So first, conservative, your typical conservative actually just, and maybe it's a caricature, maybe some of your listeners won't like this or whatever, but they just kind of want to stay at home. They want to do their 9 to 5. They want to just have things not change. They're not as ambitious. They don't want to leave their small town. They don't want to go bright lights, big city. That's not dispositionally small c conservative, at least. Your progressive often has a very zero-sum mentality. They may be ambitious, but they often believe at a very fundamental level that the rich are rich because the poor are poor.
And that's in a sense this parasitic progressive that they have an enormous difficulty in actually envisioning and constructing a preferred future because it's almost always against something. And so in some ways they back into the future because they're always pushing against the past and they're feeling themselves to be progressive, but they're backing into the future because they just keep pushing against it.
That one person's gain is another person's loss necessarily. And they feel it's a zero-sum conflict and the state, is their weapon and so on. And the libertarian will say, live and let live, which is a vision of Little House on the Prairie, all being by themselves, etc. And win and help win is none of those three. It's ambitious in a way that the small c conservative is not. It is positive sum in a way that the progressive is not. And it is collective in a way the libertarian is not. And I think that's actually like the most powerful kind of philosophy where you are, and notice also the ordering, the sequencing, win and help win. That is to say, absolutely take care of number one. That's important because if you don't do that, you can't help others win, but do that as well.
2 questions for you, and I'm sure many more, but it strikes me that what Francis Suarez is doing, what Wyoming is doing, is very valuable as an experiment and also possibly as different prototypes. And that there are governors and mayors who would be very interested in learning more about this, but they don't know how to approach it. Mm-hmm. Is there a list of what these...
Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to another place.
I think the future will be more different from the present than is commonly understood. And that's actually so more different than ours. Was the year 2000 that different from 1970? Not really. I mean, certainly there were political changes. Obviously, China had reformed and
this gets into Dalthat's decadence thing.
Tsar had fallen and so on and so forth. But the rhythms of daily life were actually quite similar. People got up, they went to work. There's a relative constancy there. Yeah, there were phones, but they weren't smartphones. They were still basically landlines, headsets or handsets, right? Cordless, perhaps. Over the last 20 years, there's been an enormous change in terms of the rhythms of daily life. One way of thinking about that is, what was your daily life when you woke up in 1980? Okay, so you would, there'd be an alarm clock, beep, beep, beep. You'd wake up, you'd go downstairs, maybe flip on the TV to look at the morning news, make some eggs, drink some orange juice, maybe read the morning newspaper, go and drive to work, where your job involved, if you're white collar, like some papers, and if you're blue collar, you're going and hammering something or whatever. You'd come back, maybe go to the bar on the way back, or you just come straight home and play with your kids or something like that. And almost every aspect of that has now changed. How do you wake up? You wake up to your phone. What's the first thing you do?
Notice implicitly in the old story, you were married and had kids. Now,
you look at all of your email because you're getting just all these messages, right? Messages are coming into you, right? You have this personal communications device. So first thing you do is different. This is for people who are addicted to their phone, but a lot of people are. You come downstairs or you get up and maybe you've got some fitness thing that has read off your sleep. So you look at that because your sleep was also instrumented. You go to the kitchen and there's food there, but maybe you just go straight to work and you Uber Eats, food to work. Or maybe you don't go to work at all and you just work remote from your pajamas in the living room, which is totally feasible today. Your job isn't involving papers or hammering things, but it's hitting keys. Everything is with 50 people who you might have never met in person, that they're remote all around the world. Through the day, you're reading newspapers, you're reading code. Your job is just much more variable than the hammering job. Rather than pushing the same button for 20 years.
Now there's a bit of a filter in here because a lot of people don't live like this, okay? He works in a world where a lot of people do, and probably a lot of you listening to this do live like this, but I just want to notice that filter.
You're pushing a different key every second. Basically, every single second of life, from your sleep to your sleep tracker, to your food, through your ordering apps or what have you, to obviously your work, to your finances, to your communications, to where you decide to go after you finish working. Like, okay, let's do Google Maps. Now the whole map is opened up. One thing we take for granted in the 80s and 90s, when you really had to get an atlas or get a map out to go somewhere new. And you had to study because you could get lost. Getting lost was a thing. You never get lost anymore, not in the same way. So for the most part, thoroughfares were really important. People didn't really go off the beaten path that much unless you had a house over there. It was like the fewest number of turns. You really didn't drive around randomly. You didn't go to like this random coffee shop over here. The map was mostly like corridored. It wasn't opened up. And so that's all opened up now. Your recreational life, you can meet with a different person rather than the same group of friends. So in so many ways, the rhythms of life, we've turned into these sort of nomadic creatures from 20 years ago. And our political structures and our homes and a lot of those other things haven't flexed to accommodate that. And one way to think about that is there's two major ways that humans operate. There's like the hunter-gatherer, where roam around the world. Many religions, many cultures have something similar to a Garden of Eden type thing, which is whether it's in our genes from some primitive hominid ancestor that we've got all the way down, because vision is baked into the genes, of course. Like the reason you can recognize something as human, that's genetic. So maybe there's something coded into us from many, many millennia ago that recognizes Garden of Eden-like thing when we're hunter-gatherers. Who knows how it's represented? And then, of course, there's the farmer and the warrior, right, where you have a piece of land, and rather than roaming all around, you're settled in one spot, and your food is worse. It's grains. It like messes up your teeth and so on. It has you grow less, but it's more reliable. It's more consistent rather than the variable ups and downs of the hunter-gatherer. And in many ways, what I think, and this is not original, to me by any means, fusion, synthesis of a lot of different ideas, but perhaps at least this take on it is, we're going back to the hunter-gatherer way of doing things, but with technology. The best quality of life will actually be available to the digital nomad.
Best, arguable.
Who has a minimum number of possessions, has the ability to pick up and move stakes at any point, because mobility is leverage against the state, right? A state is a sessile actor. Mobility is something that you can do as an individual the state cannot do, not as easily. It can't just stretch a tendril somewhere else. So new kinds of polities will form, new ways of self-governing humans that are fundamentally network-based rather than state-based, fundamentally optimized for mobile social networks, as opposed to stationary houses, because the assumptions are fundamentally different. And, basically, for example, I define a network state as a social network with an integrated cryptocurrency and a sense of national consciousness that eventually crowdfunds territory. Okay, and I think that's a new kind of thing. That's like at least one definition of a network state. That territory doesn't have to be all in one place. It can be a cul-de-sac here, a ranch here, an apartment building here. And so you have, a group of 100,000 people, let's say, that owns pieces of territory all around the world and that is constantly in communication with each other through a social network and considers themselves to be a people. It's like national formation, distillation, that centrifugation that we talked about out of the internet. Boom, it's a network state.
And again, what interests me is to what degree have I started unwittingly an ecclesiastical network state? Many have noted that, well, Pastor Paul, I hear more hours of your content than I listen to my local church pastor. And I don't want to completely just push aside the importance of locality. And I mean, right from the start, this, whatever it is we have going here, has valued in real lifeness. But it's kind of going in a both and direction. Again, this part of the podcast just really got me thinking.
And it is like a cloud formation taking physical shape. The clouds are actually distilling down. And so, when I think about the future, I think about this type of stuff where I'm just thinking from, I'm thinking about 50 different graphs. This is going down, this is going up, this is going down, this is going up. Actually, Jordan Peterson had a good remark on this, a similar kind of train of thought, where he's like, the number of different revolutions that's happening at the same time is too hard to track. Tinder alone is a complete change in how mating happens. Swipe right, swipe left, swipe right, swipe left. That itself is like this huge thing that would dominate the textbooks of another age, because it's a massive change in how like the daily rhythms of life operate. You went from having like, have you seen the?
Well, and for Jordan Peterson, of course, again, I talked about this in the question and answer today. Part of the question is how the storyverse and the matterverse interact. And one of the key ways it does throughout human history is via mate selection. Because a lot of our hierarchies are storyverse hierarchies. And if you're competing on a storyverse hierarchy and then it gets into mate selection, you have, so my mother-in-law's name was Jeanette, and I used to make, that's genetics squared because it's Jeanette, but the child of Jeanette is, both has the genetic attributes of Jeanette plus the parenting attributes of Jeanette. It gets squared. So,
graph of how people meet their partners?
I have not.
Okay. This is an amazing graph of like how people meet their significant others, the 2020 update. Basically, each little curve here tells a story, but it's like, did you meet at church? Did you meet through your parents? Did you meet at college? Did you meet at work? And you can see like meet at work is like this boomlet that kind of drops off. It's peaked in the 80s and it drops off in the 90s with, various kinds of pathologization of something like that, right? So what dominates everything today is internet. And in particular, basically, where norms have shifted now is that it's actually more legitimate. I mean, like I've aged out of this, fortunately, right? But for my younger, friends or what have you, it is impolite to hit on, often considered, depending on the situation, it's often considered impolite to hit on somebody in real life, but it's totally okay to do so on Tinder. So of course humans are contextual, and of course the same behavior that's okay in a bar is not okay in a workplace or what have you. But now that's actually extended to digital venues as well. So Tinder alone is just this massive revolution. And then you have like 20 of them happening at the same time. And so all of those are these things where the institutions that we have are simply not built for this at all. And that's why they're straining and stressing against it, and they're going to give. And we have to have a vision for what's on the other side.
So you're more a student of destabilization or stabilization, but it just so happens that right now these multiple revolutions combine to present destabilizing forces, not so much that you view humans or the future of humans through a dystopian or pessimistic lens. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. I think there's actually a lot of good stuff that's going to come out of this. I think we are.
One of the questions will be, is this acceleration we're seeing a temporary thing, or is it part of a curve? And so there's a lot of questions there. But that section, again, got me thinking about, well, what do I see happening around me? Because I'm using these tools. I'm using a YouTube channel. I'm using a podcast. I'm using a Discord server. I'm using Twitter. What does the church look like? What is a church? I don't know. But stuff is happening and it's going somewhere. So, yeah. So, again, thanks to my colleague who pointed this out. Listen to the whole thing. Let me know what you think in the comments.